A Story of Curly Locks by Queen Holden. So this book looks very vintage, but I'm wondering if it was just made to look vintage because I only see the date of 1992 in it. I don't see it doesn't say reprinted or anything like that, so I'm not exactly sure. It's a really pretty little book. I won't read this yet because it's also in the story, so I'll just wait. A Story of Curly Locks. Here it is. Curly locks, will you be mine? You shall not wash dishes, nor feed all the swine, but sit on a cushion and sew a fine seam, and feast upon strawberries, sugar, and cream. This is all Mother Goose tells us about Curly Locks, but I'm sure you are as interested as I was to hear more. So I'm going to tell you her story as somebody told it to me. Curly Locks was a little adopted child who lived with Mrs. Glummy and Mr. Glummy and their little girl, Margola Jane Glummy. They lived in a little town in quite a big house and always had big red strawberries with lots of powdered sugar and whipped cream for their visitors. Curly Locks would have been very happy if Mrs. Glummy and Margola Jane had not been so disagreeable. They were disagreeable because they were jealous, and they were jealous because Curly Locks had beautiful curls, while Margola Jane's hair was straighter than straight. They seemed to think that the only difference that made Curly Locks pretty and Margola Jane not so pretty. Margola Jane was really just as pretty as Curly Locks, and she didn't have freckles on her little nose, and Curly Locks did. But Curly Locks was pretty in spite of that. Her eyes were blue and so merry, and her little mouth was the loveliest little mouth in the world. It was always ready to break into smiles, the sunniest sort of smiles. Disagreeable people can't ever be pretty, so Margola Jane made herself ugly with grumbling and frowns. Mrs. Glummy and Margola Jane soon became the most disagreeable people in town, and soon no one would visit the Glummies. The strawberries and cream would be all ready waiting for them, only to spoil. Mrs. Glummy blamed Curly Locks and treated her more unkindly every day. She made her wash all the dishes and feed all the swine. Swine are piggies, you know. I don't like to call them swine either, but Mother Goose does, so swine they must be. Mrs. Glummy wouldn't ever give Curly Locks any strawberries and sugar and cream, and she braided her hair back tightly so that the curls would be hidden. When one tiny rebellious curl crept out to dance around Curly Locks' little face, Mrs. Glummy would spank the little girl as if she had been disobedient instead of that tiny curl. Mr. Glummy was kinder, but silent. He was just a little man, and Mrs. Glummy wasn't quite so little. Mrs. Glummy always seemed to do the talking, so Mr. Glummy thought he might as well just let her. But he didn't think it was fair to treat Curly Locks so very differently from their own little girl. All the work Margola Jane ever did was to sit on a cushion and sew a fine seam and see that the visitors had strawberries, sugar, and cream, while Curly Locks had all the dishes to wash and all the swine to feed. Margola Jane wore dresses of silk and very fine dotted Swiss with ribbons and laces, while Curly Locks had only ginghams. But no matter how hard Mrs. Glummy tried, she couldn't make Curly Locks look other than pretty. She didn't seem to realize that it was the smiling disposition of the child that made her so pretty. Let's show the pictures. So she didn't seem to realize that it was the smiling disposition of the child that made her so pretty. Curly Locks didn't need curls and fine clothes, but she loved them both very much. She loved her curls especially because they held so many sunbeams. Curly Locks lived in her dreams. She would dream of a mother who loved her and would say, Curly Locks, will you be mine? You shall not wash dishes, nor feed all the swine, but sit on a cushion and sew a fine seam, and feast upon strawberries, sugar, and cream. She would see herself with curls out of the braids, flying in the wind, and sometimes she would fold her little apron and pretend it was a cushion. Then she would make believe she was eating strawberries and cream and all the sugar she wanted. Sometimes she would pretend she was talking to visitors, and she would have the happiest time. If people are happy within themselves, it doesn't matter what is happening without. Curly Locks was one of those little people who have beautiful thoughts and a sweet, unselfish nature, so she was always happy within herself. Mrs. Glummy and Margola Jane were mean and jealous and selfish, so no matter what they had, they could not be happy, and no matter how much Mrs. Glummy tried to curl Margola Jane's hair and tied it with big ribbon bows, she couldn't make her pretty until she could learn how to be sweet and cheerful. Mrs. Glummy grew worse every day, and as Mrs. Glummy grew worse, Margola Jane grew worse, and Mr. Glummy grew more unhappy, and poor little Curly Locks was more unkindly treated. No matter how many invitations Mrs. Glummy would write, and no matter how many strawberries with sugar and cream she had, no one would visit the Glummies. Curly Locks knew this made Mrs. Glummy more cross, but she couldn't understand why the people didn't come when such luscious, beautiful red strawberries and mountains of whipped cream awaited them. She wanted to know, so she asked the cook, the milkman, and the shopkeepers, and they all said, "Mrs. Glummy and her little girl are so disagreeable and grumpy, who would want to visit them?" Then she asked Mr. Glummy, "What makes you all so unhappy, and why don't people come to see us any more?" "It is because we are unhappy that people do not want to come see us. And we are unhappy because Mrs. Glummy and Margola Jane are so disagreeable. And they are so disagreeable because they are jealous," he answered. "But why are they jealous, Daddy Glummy?" she asked. "They have everything in the world." "No, not everything," said Mr. Glummy. "They have not even one smile. I think I too have lost all mine." Curly Locks laughed. "How funny. Everyone has smiles. Is that what makes them jealous and unhappy?" "No, Curly Locks," answered Mr. Glummy. "They don't even know they haven't any smiles. They are jealous because you have such beautiful curls, and Margola Jane has not, and because you are much prettier than Margola Jane." "I'm not. I have freckles," she said. "See, all over my nose." Mr. Glummy smiled. "Oh, you haven't lost all your smiles, Daddy Glummy," she cried. "I think Mrs. Glummy and Margola Jane must have some too. I wonder how we can make them happy." "I don't know. I guess we can't. They don't seem to want to be happy," he said, as he shook his funny bald head sadly. Curly Locks thought and thought. Maybe she could do something to make them happy. Her curls seemed to be the whole trouble. They were jealous of them. Snip, 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 off they came, and she looked like a little boy. A funny, shaggy little head, and still Curly Locks was pretty. I'm going to go back because they put the picture that goes with that part of the story earlier. Yeah, here it is. So this is where she cuts her hair off. She has scissors. You can see it's in her hand. And they're seeing her cut her hair. Okay. So then, and there's the scissors. All right. "Why did you do it?" cried Mrs. Glummy when she saw her. "I wanted to make you happy, and I wanted to make you love me," she answered sweetly. I don't need my curls, and since Margola Jane hasn't any, why should I have them?" "You are a sweet, unselfish child," said Mrs. Glummy, and she knew then what a selfish, foolish person she had been. "Will you forgive me, Curly Locks?" she asked. The child smiled, and Mrs. Glummy smiled, and Margola Jane smiled, and Mr. Glummy smiled, and then what do you think Mrs. Glummy said? Curly Locks, will you be mine? You shall not wash dishes, nor feed all the swine, but sit on a cushion and sew a fine seam, and feast upon strawberries, sugar, and cream." Soon the cook and the milkman and the shopkeepers began to talk of how cheerful the Glummies were, and people came to visit them, just to see if they were really cheerful. Here's the picture of people came to visit them. And then, of course, they came again and again. The strawberries and sugar and cream were always finished up, and never did they spoil. Curly Locks' hair soon grew long again, and Mrs. Glummy tied big, beautiful bows to it, just like Margola Jane wore, and she dressed her in the same sort of lovely dresses. Margola Jane's hair actually curled up softly at the ends, and though it wasn't really curly, it was much less straight than it had been. Margola Jane had learned to smile and be sweet, and she was just as pretty as Curly Locks. Smiles are like sunshine. They make people beautiful, just like the sunshine makes the day beautiful. So smile, dear children, and be cheerful and contented, and you will always be happy and pretty. And that is the end. Have a good night.